Yes, you can have a mold problem without smelling it. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Number one is it could be dormant. Mold produces those microbial gases. Think of them as digestive gases, the same way we produce gases when we digest. And incidentally, those are not our gases; those are also microbial VOCs. We're really not digesting; we're ambulatory composters, if you really think about it. And so it's not dissimilar in the sense that mold is digesting your building, but it doesn't have a stomach, it doesn't have a digestive tract. It's doing this externally, and so it's releasing those gases into the air as it sort of breaks down, as it breaks down the stable components like drywall paper into nutrition, and then it releases these byproducts, some of which are gases. And so that's what we pick up as the musty smell. Now,
hello, everyone, and welcome to your Indoor Air podcast brought to you by Change the Air Foundation. My name is Kendra Seymour, and today we're going to be talking about that moldy smell, what it is, what it might mean for your home and your health. Now, the technical term that you may have heard for this is microbial volatile organic compounds, or mVOCs for short. So to help us understand what our nose knows, see what I did there? Our guest today is Jason Earle. So thank you, Jason, so much for being here.
it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, if you don't know Jason yet, he is a man on a mission, an adoring father of 2 boys in diapers. He's an incurable entrepreneur and indoor air quality crusader. He's the founder and CEO of Got Mold and the creator of the Got Mold test kit. Now, the realization that his moldy childhood home was the underlying cause of his extreme allergies and asthma led him into the healthy home business in 2002, leaving behind a successful career on Wall Street. Over the last 2 decades, Jason has personally performed countless sick building investigations, solving many medical mysteries along the way, helping thousands of families recover their health and peace of mind. He is featured and appeared on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover Home Edition, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired, and more. So yes, I'm so excited that you're here. I know you and I have had some really interesting conversations around mVOC, so I'm excited to dig in and help our listeners learn a little bit more about what might be going on in the home. So let's start though with kind of an orienting thing. And it's going to seem like a simple question, but I think this is where a lot of people start. You know, if you smell mold in your home, it's an indicator that there's probably something going on. But if I can't smell mold in my home, do I have a problem?
Very, very good question. And also, thank you so much for having me. Really, it's a pleasure to have this conversation sort of in public because we've had so many interesting conversations, and I wish we had pressed record for those as well. So,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
I'm glad we finally are, though. Yes. And I think
absolutely.
our problem will be is keeping to the time restraint. So we'll do the best that we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. Maybe it'll be part two, perhaps.
Yeah,
So,
there you go. I'm sure we'll
okay,
have follow-up questions, though.
absolutely. So yes, you can have a mold problem without smelling it. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Number one is it could be dormant. Mold produces those microbial gases. Think of them as digestive gases, the same way we produce gases when we digest. And incidentally, those are not our gases; those are also microbial VOCs. We're really not digesting; we're ambulatory composters, if you really think about it. And so it's not dissimilar in the sense that mold is digesting your building, but it doesn't have a stomach, it doesn't have a digestive tract. It's doing this externally, and so it's releasing those gases into the air as it sort of breaks down, as it breaks down the stable components like drywall paper into nutrition, and then it releases these byproducts, some of which are gases. And so that's what we pick up as the musty smell. Now, if it's dormant, those metabolic processes stop. That doesn't mean that you don't have a mold problem. That just means that it's not actively producing these things. The other thing is sometimes the pathway to you is not clear, right? In other words, air has to get to you in order for an odor to get to you. And so, depending upon how the building is built and depending upon ventilation and lots of different variables, sometimes you can have active mold growth in a building producing mVOCs, and you're simply not, they're not being received by your olfactory sense, by your sense of smell.
Yeah. And I think too, what's interesting is, and I'm glad you brought up the dormant state, because sometimes people will say, well, I only notice a smell like after a big storm or like intermittent, maybe only during a certain season of the year. And that's because it's going in and out of the feeding cycle. So I do want to like unpack what an actual mVOC is a little bit more, but right before we hopped on, you brought up something really important, that sometimes people don't understand the difference between a mycotoxin and an mVOC. Now, without taking us all down the mycotoxin path, can you just orient real quick, like maybe spore and mycotoxin, so that people kind of understand these different components? I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we go further.
Yeah, as you know, this is like a field of rabbit holes. But for the sake of simplicity, essentially, when we're talking about mold, we have three big buckets. This is hyper reduced for simplicity. So it's spores, which are essentially those hardy reproductive capsules, seed-like capsules that go forth and multiply, right? And so we pick those up in spore traps and and dust tests and things like that for analysis. Um, the other component that's very commonly discussed, but I would argue very poorly understood, even especially amongst people who purport to be experts in this space, are mycotoxins. These will get all the headlines. And what's interesting is, a hundred or so of them produce these compounds and even so do them intermittently. So not necessarily a great marker, honestly, for the presence of mold growth. But that's a different conversation. The third bucket, which is probably the most overlooked, but probably the most abundant, honestly, when it comes to a mold problem, and perhaps the most pernicious, is the musty odor, which are these microbial VOCs. Now, we all know, or most of us know, about VOCs in terms of the man-made ones, right? So like when you walk into a new house, or you get your new car, or that those smells, gasoline, a smell that's both toxic and also much loved by many people. These VOCs are also produced by microbes. And so because they're gases, they are volatile, and that means that they evaporate into the air. And unlike spores and mycotoxins, they do not penetrate walls readily. They do penetrate walls readily. The mycotoxins and spores do not penetrate walls readily because they are physical matter as opposed to they're particles and crystals, and they do not penetrate. The mVOCs do penetrate the walls. So if I'm being clear, so the idea here is that there are lots of other compounds, by the way, that molds produce. I mean, thousands of different compounds. There's beta glucans and there's ergosterol and there's all these other things. But for the sake of simplicity, when we're talking about, especially when it comes to testing for these things, we really look at spores, mycotoxins, and microbial volatile organic compounds. And people often confuse the mycotoxins and the microbial volatile organic compounds, which would be a fun thing for us to unpack.
Yeah. So to kind of like maybe summarize that, the mVOCs, so we'll be using that term when we talk about the musty odor going forward. So we'll use mVOCs to kind of capture that. Is a gas, right? And it's something that, unlike mycotoxins, all molds produce mVOCs, right? It's the
That's right.
process by which they're digesting the building material. Whereas not all molds produce mycotoxins, and those are particles, not gases.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, awesome. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm glad you differentiated, because people are maybe have heard the term VOC. We're talking again about the mVOCs. But if they're always produced, then is there always a noticeable odor? I know you talked before about, air currents bringing it to our nose, but there is some variance sometimes when we talk about that moldy smell. Sometimes people will say it's, oh, it's a musty smell. It smells like grandma's basement. But then I've heard people describe, it sometimes like, oh, it almost smells like, dirty socks, or I've heard, cat urine. Is there something that accounts for the variance in these odors?
Sure. So when we're talking about microbial VOCs, notice we didn't say mold VOCs.
Yeah.
And that's an important distinction. And again, rabbit holes abound.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about microbes, we have to, also talk about bacteria.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of talk recently about actinomycetes and other bacteria that do grow in tandem in the same conditions that allow mold to grow. Actinomycetes are actually soil bacteria, but they do really, really well in damp buildings, and they produce some signature scents also, earthy scents like geosmin, for example, which might smell like a wet a potted plant. So sometimes more of an earthy smell. There are lots of different compounds that all come together in sort of a potpourri, if
Yeah.
you will. And depending upon what it's eating, just like when we make different smells when we eat different things, when mold's growing on different materials, or what we call in the trade substrates, then it will produce different compounds. Also, depending upon where it is in its life cycle, and how it, whether it's being threatened or not. And there's just so many different variables. Temperature has an impact on these things. And so when we look at when we're talking about these odors, they are all different. However, there's also a commonality amongst them. It's just like everybody knows the smell of feces, even though, believe it or not, they all have different compounds coming off of that too, right? There's sort of a signature poo smell, and there's kind of a signature damp smell. And so we know this sort of instinctively as humans, being around this for many thousands of years. But it is, in fact, a different sort of composition in almost every circumstance.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important point, because when we're talking about the real world situation in your home, and if you have water damage, you have a variety of building materials and drywall and wood, and you might have insulation. And as that's getting wet, you may not have just mold, you're going to have mold, and you're going to have bacteria. And as those things break down, they're creating their own mVOCs, to your point. But then, does this, or to what extent does it occur? Like if I have mold behind my wall, or maybe it's underneath the bathroom or kitchen, and it's breaking down that material, can mold release VOCs from building materials? And does that
Mm.
get into our air as well?
Yes, and so there's something called hydrolysis, which is this effect of essentially temperature and humidity in the release of volatile compounds. And so, yes, as soon as you get something wet, you're going to potentially change its chemistry. And so, also, of course, in the breakdown of these materials, you're going to release different compounds that may be in those materials. And so mold does this really fun thing. Everyone talks about methylation these days too when it comes to detoxification, and it's something that I think very people really understand. In fact, I'm not no expert in it either. But what's fascinating is that mold and bacteria also have the ability to take things that are in its on its plate, right? And instead of assimilating it, because it may actually be toxic to the microbe, it can pass it through itself and change its composition and release it. And so David Krauss, who actually is on our summit, talks a bit about this. In fact, he's written on this. And so there's a case of this toxic compound called Scheele's green. It was a paint used back in the 1700s, and it was made with arsenic, which of course is very toxic, and we know not to mess around with that stuff. But they had it on everything, right? Clothing and wallpaper, and they found, even back then, I don't know how they did this, because we could barely figure this out now probably, but people were getting sick, and some cases they were dying, and couldn't figure out why. And somebody very wisely figured out that there was Scopulariopsis was actually growing on this pigmented wallpaper, and instead of being killed or inhibited by the arsenic, it was actually methylating the arsenic and turning it into arsine gas, which is highly toxic to people. And so, yes, the long short answer is what is there will either be digested or released, essentially. And then there's some essentially, you might call it sort of digestive ash left behind, right? The sort of the stuff that's going to be left to the next round of microbes.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. That's that story, that example. I've heard him talk about that before. Like when you really think about it, it is like this potpourri. It's not a single thing. It's the bacteria and the mold and the building materials that you're smelling. And I know, and I'll drop a link to it because I know you've shared a lot of Joan Bennett's stuff, and talked to her. She's got some great papers we'll link to, and even just from fungal VOCs and VOCs. I think there's like 300, identified individual types of mVOCs, and there's even more for plants and bacteria. And so it really is like a giant science experiment in your home. And it does not help that we build our homes out of mold food, right? Like it's not
No,
mold's
it does
fault,
not.
and it's just doing its job. It's unfortunately very inconvenient and can cause health issues. So on that note, let's pivot, because obviously nobody likes that smell. And if it was just a matter of smell, maybe, I don't know, you'd be like less rushed, but we know there's more to it. So can you talk to us a little bit about the known or what we believe to be health effects associated with mVOCs?
Yes, and this has been an area of great interest for me for 22 years, mostly because in my early days, I pioneered the use of mold sniffing dogs, and they target the source of that odor, right? That's what dogs do. They find if there's something that has a unique sort of fingerprint scent, there's no better tool than a dog. And we consistently found buildings that had musty odors and relatively normal spore counts, but serious symptoms. And then it would get remediated. We'd find mold in walls and we'd find the source, and then we'd, come back and do the necessary testing. All the odors are gone and the moisture problem's been corrected and the symptoms go away. And so this really, had me thinking for a very long, it's been 2 decades now, that this plays an outsized role in mold related illness. And the research that has emerged since then, especially Joan Bennett's research, who is a dear friend, largely because she called once after seeing us, by the way, on the news and said, "I'd like to meet your dog. It's okay if you come too." So she invited me up to her lab, and we bonded over microbial volatiles, and I haven't stopped. And so the typical mold related symptoms for a lot of people, aside from the allergic symptoms, and by the way, mVOCs can trigger allergic symptoms, so I don't want to skip over that, but tend to be cognitive, right? So headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and cognitive impairment. These are the sort of hallmark symptoms that most people complain about when they first have a mold exposure. These are also the symptoms of VOC exposure, by the way, right? So chemical exposure. And so it's no coincidence that these things overlap. It's not a Venn diagram. It's a straight up boom, right? These are concentric circles, if anything, rather than overlapping. And so, and then what's really fascinating is that there's emerging research around sort of the mechanism of how these things impact, especially people that are really sensitive to this stuff. Once you've had a big mold exposure, once you've had a big chemical exposure, oftentimes a chemical exposure creates a mold sensitivity. Mold sensitivity creates the chemical exposure. Anyone who's listening to this has been through it, knows exactly what I'm talking about. And also a sort of a hyperactive nervous system, right, where you suddenly become there's a lot of fear, visceral fear. There's a lot of overactive immune responses. There's inflammation, things like that. And so the mechanism for that has not really been well understood until you start looking at the trigeminal nerve, and this is fascinating stuff. So it's the fifth cranial nerve. With endings in the eyes, mouth, and jaw, and so it works with the olfactory, with the sense of smell, but shares data with it, but it senses things below the odor threshold, and that's really key. And so what happens is they're designed, or the primary sensory input is heat, pain, and cold for the trigeminal nerve, but they have a chemosensory or a chemical sensory component too. And once they become irritated, and specifically they get irritated by pungent VOCs. Now, microbial VOCs fall neatly into that category of pungent VOCs, right? Ammonia is also a pungent VOC, and so when you're cutting onions, also that's why your eyes water. So this is all part of that same mechanism, right? And so what happens is when you become sensitized, these small amounts of small exposures can irritate that trigeminal nerve and trigger a cytokine storm, which triggers an inflammatory response, which manifests in so many different ways depending upon your existing health profile. If you've got autoimmune disease, suddenly you've got a flare up, right? If whatever is going on in your body, when you have cytokine storm, especially if you've got Lyme or something else that also travels that same pathway, double whammy, triple whammy. And so this is why it gets really, really messy. And this is also, by the way, why so many people who have this condition have this sixth sense. They have like a spidey sense. They walk into a building, they go, "I can't be here," and they have this overactive response, and no one else feels that way. And it has not been explained up until very recently. And then, sort of putting a point on that, what's also fascinating is that there's a number of studies that show that anxiety exacerbates that response. And ironically, of course, with that response triggers anxiety. And
Hmm.
so you
Yeah.
end up in this really negative loop, this vicious cycle of pain and suffering of anxiety. And oftentimes this is why we see people do really, really well with neural retraining
Mhm.
once they're able to, either remediate or relocate.
I mean, okay, there is so many things we could unpack here, but let's start a little bit then. And I promise we're going to get to the dog because I know someone's going to ask some questions, so we'll do that next. But I want to
Sure.
unpack the health side a little bit more. So this trigeminal nerve, this is really interesting because if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that it can perceive things and notice things at a lower threshold than what you would before I would, oh, that smells bad. And so
That's
it's
right.
like an early warning system. And I know, having been impacted myself and others, if you've been down this road, sometimes you'll say you're a canary, or even to this day, I can smell things long before anyone else in my family. Like I can walk into, I walked into my parents' home probably about 10 years ago, and I walked over this threshold and I was like, something's going on right here. I was the only one who could smell it. And turns out I was right. But that's really, I think, important for people to understand too, because I mean, let's be honest, this is a stressful situation. And so it can cause anxiety. Then you're anxious already, and then you get into this loop. So if you don't mind, let's take a moment though and delve a little bit more into that connection with multiple chemical sensitivity.
Hmm.
Sometimes you'll see it as tilt, right?
Yes.
Because to your point, a lot of people who have been in buildings that have made them sick from mold now suddenly are having a hard time with other chemical exposures. They can't walk down the laundry aisle at the grocery store, the perfume from their coworker, the cleaning products in their home. All of a sudden, they are reacting to everything. And I know you're not a doctor, but can you speak to kind of what is going on there, what you've seen with some of your clients and just with your history there?
Sure. So it's extremely common, more so than probably anyone really knows until they get into this space, and you see that this is sort of a hallmark of a big exposure. So MCS has been stigmatized, although the chemical industry about 8 or 9 years ago acknowledged it and sort of took ownership of it, but at the same time, the stigma has never really gone away. So Claudia Miller.
Yeah.
Um, who's an amazing researcher down at the University of Texas. She just is also a falls into the sensitive population and has been affected by this, and so her research is like many of us very personal as well. And she retermed this. TILT, as you mentioned, which stands for toxicant induced loss of tolerance. And so I'm telling you all this because it explains it very well. So that what that means is it's the exact opposite of an addiction. An addiction, with alcohol, for example, or caffeine, is something that you will drink or consume more and more and more of to get lesser and lesser of a desired result. And so ultimately, you get a tolerance. When it comes to these kinds of exposures, it's the exact opposite, where a toxicant induced loss of tolerance. So these smaller and smaller and smaller exposures result in larger and larger and larger undesired outcomes. And so you end up with these, severe hypersensitive reactions. And so what we know is that this is largely a nervous system issue. And so but the treatments for it are, have long been sort of elusive. And that's why I point to the neural retraining, the work of like, Kat King at Primal Trust and DNRS and Gupta Method and Reorigin. There's a handful of these that are doing really good work and sort of, they all have a different approach, but essentially they're getting to the same place, which is like allergy shots for the nervous system. Smaller exposures, controlled exposures of the perceived threat until your body sort of like PTSD training, if you will, or
Sure.
PTSD therapy. And in many ways, you have to look at this as a trauma. I would assert that this is a trauma, that when people have this experience, that it is an injury, and it is an injury to your nervous system, more so probably than anything else. And resetting that is a challenge, but it is the only proven pathway that I know of to get people out of this really horrible loop. And it is something that I think people oftentimes get marginalized for this. Their friends and family don't want to be around. It's very difficult to be with someone who can't be around. It's social situations. You can't go to
Sure.
the hardware store, like you said, or the dry cleaner. But I often encourage the people that I work with to consider this as not a weakness, but actually as a superpower. because the things that you're reacting to are bad for everyone. And so you just happen to get the email first. You get the signal first, right?
Mhm.
And so you can protect yourself. This is a strength, not a weakness. It's a matter of channeling it. And so that's why that work is so important, because even the people who do get over it, they still maintain a sensitivity. They just don't have that outrageous reaction that's debilitating and disruptive to them and everyone around them.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because for those listening, going forward this year, we are going to be talking a lot about VOCs in general, whether they're microbial VOCs or they're coming from your building materials or your cleaning products, what that means. We're going to be talking about multiple chemical sensitivity a lot, until I hope to have Claudia Miller on. And so there's going to be information coming for those listening, because it really is, I look at what happened to us. The silver lining is we are more aware now, right? We live more consciously, we live more healthfully, we make better choices, and we're more intentional. And so I try to embrace that side of it. But that's super important. And for clarity, because talking about neural retraining, I'm assuming you agree with me on this. We are not saying that you can continue to be exposed to these things and then just like retrain your brain. You still need to work to reduce or eliminate exposure first. What you're saying, if I'm understanding, is it's this idea that they work in tandem together. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes. There's a couple of points there. First of all, uh, you can't recover from a trauma if you're still being traumatized,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's just not. You're never going to recover from violence if you're still dealing with violence, right? So you need to, it's you need to have space and distance from that so that you have perspective, because a lot this is perceptual in many ways, right? And so distance gives you the ability to have perspective. And so yes, fundamentally, you need to remediate or relocate or reduce exposure to the degree that you no longer are having chronic recurring symptoms, right? So the assault must stop. The idea is to train your nervous system and your mind to be able to consciously get to the state of equilibrium on command. And I know that may seem like a huge leap, but that's the goal here, right? In fact, I think that's the ultimate superpower, is to be able to relax on command at any time in any circumstance. And I think that's as a general rule, that would be a good thing for us all to learn how to do, right? How to just be calm in any circumstance. And so yes, you need to be separate from it. And I think that's very important. The other piece is, I think, I credit you with, widening the conversation here, about indoor air quality, about mold in general, because I can't, in good conscience, knowing what I know, talk about mold without talking about VOCs in the same breath.
Mhm.
Because A, they produce the VOCs, but also I think mold is kind of like the gateway drug to indoor air quality.
Yeah.
People see it, they smell it, they know that there's a problem. It's caused by usually a defined circumstance,
Mhm.
and the remediation is fairly defined, hopefully. But when it comes to VOCs, that's much more nebulous. And so nobody calls us and say, I think I've got a VOC problem.
Yeah.
Um, they call us because they say, I'm sick in my building and I don't know what's going on. And mold generally is the sort of calling card. And so this gives us an opportunity to widen the conversation, because I believe that every building in the United States, unless it's been consciously designed otherwise, has a VOC problem to some
Yeah.
degree. And because we live in these very tight boxes that recirculate the same air, and we many times aren't even leaving the building anymore at all.
Right.
We are breathing 20,000 times a day, getting 20,000 doses of man-made VOCs, no matter what, and then in circumstances where there's a moisture problem, adding on to it, and which many times I think is the straw that breaks the camel's
Yeah.
back. Right? You've been breathing this stuff on a chronic basis, probably getting sensitized along the way, so that when the mold comes, you're already tuned up. And
Yeah.
so, there's a lot of things that we need to look at about, not bringing these things into our house, having the right kind of filtration with carbon. There's a lot of different conversations about what can be done, but the bottom line is, I really think it's an important conversation to include this holistically.
Yeah, you're spot on. It's kind of the entry point, I think, for a lot of people. And then once you start, it's kind of like peeking behind the curtain, and you start seeing all these things and how they interplay. And I know you've done a lot with Corbett Lunsford. He talks about home chemistry and the home and how everything works together. Um, so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but you brought up something that I think is a good segue. You talked about testing. And I do want to say one thing before we move on. For anyone listening, if you have mold or water damage, and you're not sure where to start, you can head on over to changetheairfoundation.org and go to our resource tab. We have a start here section that takes you step by step through the process. It helps you find a good IEP. That's the person you're going to bring in first to do a thorough investigation of your home. And then what does safe and effective remediation look like? And so I don't want to leave people hanging, but we're not going to get into that for the purposes of this conversation, or we'd be here for like 8 hours. But I want to talk about testing specifically for VOCs, because listen, if I smell a moldy smell, like, do I even need to test for VOCs? How accurate is testing? I mean, is that even something we need to worry about, or should we just move on to, all right, I need to find the source of moisture and the problem and take steps to remediate that correctly? Like, talk about testing for
It's a
mVOCs.
really good question. And, we tested for mVOCs for a very long time with very mixed results. I believe that the nose is the best test. Unfortunately, sometimes we have a poor sense of smell. Sometimes we also become inured to these things. Our our human, our human, humans' sense of scent um, gets muted within about 30 seconds. So we're unlike dogs, which can purge their olfactory receptors at will with a puff of air. So we don't have that ability. That's why you'll go into the department store and they'll have you smell coffee or something else to sort of reset your sense of smell. So being outside the house for a while is usually a good way for you to do that assessment. I always say the nose knows, and you generally know. People intuitively know when something's sort of amiss in their house, especially when it comes to odor. The microbial volatile organic compound testing is riddled with problems, quite frankly. And it ranges from the way they're collected, especially when a consumer is doing it, to the way the samples are stored, what temperature they're shipped at, and then the analysis itself, and then whether you're looking for the different sort of, there's a big range of volatiles, and there's semi-volatiles, and there's highly, so it is messy, and the tests that are on the market have failed me many times, where I've been in very musty spaces collecting these samples, knowing that they would come back high for a lawsuit, for a legal support, and they came back normal.
Mhm.
And so that does not exactly engender confidence, right? So
Yeah.
my strong suggestion at this point is that if you smell it, you have it. The goal then is to find the source of the or sources of moisture. And oftentimes there's more than one. And this can be tricky. And the reason it's tricky is because moisture comes in many forms, not just liquid intrusion. Oftentimes it comes from a source of humidity that you may or may not be aware of, and it may be caused by a ventilation issue and so many different things. And this is really when professionals carry their weight. A qualified professional is doing a mold assessment is not really doing a mold inspection. They're doing a moisture assessment.
Right.
And they're looking, the mold is sort of the smoking gun when you find it. And that's like, hey, I found it. Great. Now I found mold on a surface. Now I can really find the moisture problem, because I can trace it back from there. Right. So the musty smell is often the first clue, but it's also a health hazard, right? According to Joan Bennett's work, it's a neurotoxin, and there's all sorts of really serious issues beyond the cognitive impairment that we talked about. And so you have to, when you smell it, and like I always say, if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something, and do it quickly, because the longer it grows, the more expensive it gets to remove, and the longer your exposure is, the more likely you can end up with longer term consequences.
Yeah, no, all of that is super helpful. And I think this is why I know people, they tend to, if they have a moisture problem, maybe they see it, they're lucky enough and it's visible, or mold, and they jump right to the remediation company. And I tend to suggest that people take a step back and work with a good IEP, a qualified IEP who's going to do that thorough investigation. Because if let's say you as the homeowner, you smell it, but you're looking around and you don't see anything, this is where you need the expert, especially with odors. Like, if you talk to a really good IEP, they will say, like, oh man, odors are hard to track down. And that's for a number of reasons, right? The way that air moves throughout our home, especially our tighter built homes, you can have, something in the basement, there's something called stack effect, and the air is moving up. I always think about this stuff, like, if you've ever like burned popcorn, or if you're making like cookies, and then, all of a sudden my kids upstairs come downstairs like, oh, what did you make? Right? It's because they
Yeah,
are doing. So you really have to be a detective to figure out where is this odor coming from. And it always comes back to moisture. And so I love that you brought that up, that a good inspection, it's about finding that moisture. It's about finding that source. Um,
always.
Super helpful. Now, because this is super interesting, can we talk about mold dogs for a second and
My
just
pleasure.
okay, so what I find really interesting about this, and I've been dealing with mold and indoor air quality for probably 12 years now. So, but long before some of the bigger groups organized online, and I remember I've watched over the years as this has become a more popular option for people are these mold dogs as a piece of the investigation. And you said something that I thought was interesting, that the dog's nose works a little different, right? They don't like fully inhale like humans. So talk to us about just mold dogs in general. What are some things that, might want to be on people's radar when thinking about using that as a tool in their tool belt?
First of all, it was the best thing I ever did. I had Oreo we were in the field for 12 years. I had a fleet of dogs. She was my first one and my last one. And it was life-changing for me and for everyone that she touched. She taught me actually where mold hides. Honestly, I got my education really from a dog. She would show me where the moisture problems manifest in buildings so effectively that I saw patterns within my region that allowed me to be able to go in and find stuff even without her. But I would never have been able to have that kind of insight had I not been walked. Essentially, when people are walking the dog, who's walking who? She walked me through buildings and showed me exactly where to drill. And so I think there's a lot of different things to talk about with dogs, and I'll be as brief as I can because I know we're limited on time. But first of all, a dog is one tool. Okay.
Yes,
We
thank you.
always say in dog we trust, in dog we trust, but trust but verify, right? So, in other words, when we did inspections, we would first of all do a very thorough physical inspection of the property first to make sure there are no hazards, including visible mold. Because if you have visible mold, A, it's a hazard for the dog, and B, it's unnecessary to use a dog. It's visible. So the best application for a dog is there's an odor or or symptoms, and we don't know where they're coming from. Boom. And you do a very formulaic search pattern throughout the building. Mark all the spots where the dog alerts, and then go back through and investigate with moisture meter, a closer visual assessment, as well as moisture meters. And then we drill holes in the walls in areas where they alerted, and pull wall cavity samples out, spore trap wall checks. And then from there, we could, determine if there was investigative demolition necessary and these kinds of things. There are people that are using dogs alone and that are not doing that second step. This is danger zone.
Yep.
You cannot write a spec, in other words, a remediation plan from a visual assessment. You cannot write one just from air samples. You cannot write one just from dust samples. You cannot write one just from a dog. You have to do usually all of them if you can. And this is where cost comes in. But by the way, a dog will reduce the cost because there's a lot less error. There's a lot less guesswork. Hey, where am I going to drill? Oh, should I do here or there? The dog just do you see that wet spot on the wall where the dog's nose was?
Mhm.
Literally, Oreo would peg the wall with, and I would see these little nose mark, put the sticker right on that spot, right? Um, and so we were able to reduce the size of the remediation also because we could find exactly where it was and surgically extract it instead of all these ripping holes in people's walls based upon a dust test, which is highly inaccurate, destructive, unnecessary, and often fruitless. And so I'm a huge fan of the dogs. I would still have one if I didn't have two little kids and a fast growing startup, right? I mean, it's just
Yeah.
a lot
Oh,
of
sure.
work. It's truly transformative, and also the dog has to be not just well trained. So I'm a big fan of the Florida Canine Academy. Bill Whitstein, who's a decades old friend of mine, of course. But there are a lot of people that are sort of backyard dog training. You've got to get dogs that are trained and that are recertified on at least an annual basis. That's really important.
I'm really glad you brought that up. And I feel like a broken record. And this is something I want everyone to understand, that every tool and every test, right? You don't ever make a determination about your home based on any single data point. And you have to understand what a tool or cast or dog can and can't do, because there are limitations, there are strengths, and you have to understand that before you go in. And I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think sometimes people will say, oh no, this is what you need. And it's about understanding how all of these data points come together to give you that big picture. I like to think of it as a puzzle. And so
Yes.
when you're working with an IEP or whoever it is that you hire, you really want them doing that like multi-pronged approach. And I'm glad you brought up that, just like with anybody doing any kind of test, that not all IEPs are created the same, not all dog handlers are created the same. And it's about asking the right questions and doing your homework to find really the best person that's going to help you with this. So I know that, and I want to bring it up quickly because I know we're over time. Sometimes people will say, though, like, what about the health of the dog? So I know you said if there's visible mold, you're like, I don't even need it, right? But
Yep.
is there health concerns here for the dog? Like their nose works a little different. Speak to that. You alluded to it earlier.
Yeah, there's a few really important points there. First of all, think about a dog and when it goes outside. What does it do? Puts
Like
his
sniff
nose
the
right in
ground.
the
Yeah.
soil, right? And it's going right in the dirt and then in the leaves and everything. All the mold spores in your house, if you've got a healthy home, are coming from outside.
Mhm.
That's where they originated. And so dogs have a natural resistance to these kinds of things, with the exception of the short-nosed dogs. By the way, we don't use those in detection, and also dogs that are sick, that have a compromised immune system, that are ill. And by the way, those are dogs that are usually in sick homes or that are old. And so they can be more susceptible to these kinds of things. So you've heard about Muffin, who was Ed McMahon's dog, died from mold exposure. Yes, this is terrible. The dog is living in a moldy house, right? And by the way, closer to the ground, breathing probably 100,000 times a day, has 5 times the exposure per pound of body weight, just like babies do. So yes, babies and puppies and dogs, rather, pets in general, have a much higher exposure rate, and so therefore have a higher likelihood of developing serious consequences from indoor environmental issues. But mold dogs, first of all, should be living in a home that doesn't have a mold problem. Number one. Number two, when we already screened the property, so we're not going to bring them into a place where there's visible mold. Second of all, my Oreo was in the house maximum 10 minutes. Incredible. Big houses. I mean, really big houses. We were in there for a while, but her exposure was minimal anyway. I was getting all the exposure. And then on top of it, and I guess the most important thing is that the dog's nose is designed differently. It doesn't actually inhale the way we do. We smell, we actually have to inhale. They have different chambers within their nose where they can bring in these little puffs and run them past their receptors, and then they purge. That's why a dog go, right? So
Right.
that release is actually the purge that allows for another scent profile to be picked up, and then they can sort of, you know, adjust their tack to get closer to the source. And so dogs have a natural resistance to this stuff, and their noses are designed differently. And again, if a lovingly cared for mold dog will probably be healthier than the average dog. Anyway, I mean, Oreo was 14 when she died, and she was never sick until the week that she died. And amongst the many, many bulldogs I've known, they've been some of the most healthy and robust pups I've ever known. And I also mentioned this, they're also the most interesting ones because they tend to be very involved with people. They they
Yeah.
they kind of understand they've got a job and
Yeah.
they really relish that. And if you ever want to learn more about how dogs respond to this stuff, look up Martin Seligman's work with learned optimism, and how he essentially learned about pessimism and optimism through exposing dogs to different experiences. And the dogs that actually had some locus of control where they were actually able to sort of control a couple things, they thrived. And so I saw that manifest with our working dogs as well. All dogs are at risk if they're not well taken care of, and those things are not adhered to. Those very important steps are not taken to protect them. But a well cared for mold dog is both safe and effective.
That is awesome. And I so appreciate you taking the time to kind of unpack that for a little bit for us, even though we're over
My
time.
pleasure.
So
Yeah.
kind of bringing this all together, if you're listening to this, if you have that moldy smell or what we characterize as a moldy smell, I definitely want you to take steps to get that evaluated by a very knowledgeable indoor environmental professional. Again, you can head on over to changetheairfoundation.org, go to our resource tab, and the very first thing you're going to see is start here, and we're going to take you through how to do that. If you don't have a smell, doesn't mean you don't have a problem. You can still, if you suspect there's a problem, if you have unexplained health symptoms, if you've had a previous history of water damage, if you just want to make sure that the air in your home is healthy and that you don't, again, head on over, find that good IEP, understand that it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not about any single test or any single tool. It's about the whole picture, and we walk you through that on our website. Jason, thank you so much. If people had follow-up questions or wanted to get into contact with you, how could they do that? Because we'll link to it in the show notes.
Sure. So we created a welcome page for all of your listeners. You go to gotmold.com/change the air. And there you'll find a copy of our ebook, which is 46 pages of inspection checklists and FAQs. And it's really helpful for people that are early in their mold awareness journey. And then from there, our contact form on our website is a really great way for people to ask questions. And we also take live questions at Instagram. We have a sort of an open Ask Jason post that's pinned at the top. So I encourage people to post questions there so that everyone else gets the benefit. And then I'll also do a little shameless plug here. We also just launched the Got Mold Summit. Actually, it's going live February 20th through the 23rd. And so it's gotmoldsummit.com. And a lot of the people that we talked about, that we quoted today and that we referenced, David Krause and Joan Bennett. Unfortunately, Claudia wasn't able to join us. And Carl Grimes, who I think was also on your show. So
David
they're
Myrick, our remediator.
And David Myrick, yeah,
yeah.
Who
Husband Catterai is
absolutely
our medical advisory panel. He's on there. You've got a great lineup there. So I definitely encourage people to check that out. Lots of great information.
Absolutely. Great. So thank you so much for having me. This has been absolutely fabulous.
No, thank you. And for everyone listening, if you found this interview helpful, do me a favor, head on over to changetheairfoundation.org and sign up for our newsletter, because it really is the best way to get great information like this directly to your inbox. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.